Hello, everybody, again, and welcome to the podcast that has still yet to be named, only 6 weeks later. I am here with wonderful guests. We have David, who you've seen before, tech company CEO and passionate about AI. We have the marvelous Peter Nixley, full stack developer and AI implementation consultant. Bravo. Ed was here, he left, so I'm not going to introduce him. You'll get that next week. Glenn, focusing on how we use AI in healthcare and fresh off the boat, it seems. Today, what we're going to be talking about is something that I have very limited knowledge of, and I'm really hoping that you guys will help fill the gap, MCPs and how you're using them. So just so that everyone and myself can be informed, what is an MCP?
I'll jump in on this. So an MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, and it's a protocol. It doesn't actually do anything on its own. And what it refers to is how the AI can connect to an API. So it's an API for APIs. It's like a way of describing APIs. Now, that's a pretty abstract description, so it doesn't mean much to people. But if you think about when ChatGPT first came out, but immediately the things that people were talking about were things like, oh, I want it to like read my calendar and then read my email and check what my availability is on my calendar and reply to the person or put in a new calendar invitation. But to do that, it's got to connect to the calendar and it's got to connect to the email. And to do that, you either have to, you've got to describe to the AI somehow how to do it. And so the Model Context Protocol makes it really easy for it to do it. And so it allows for that use case, which is the use case that everyone's waiting for. But it also means that you should be able to do things like in ChatGPT, in Claude Desktop today, because Claude Desktop has MCP, you will be able to say things like if, for instance, Zero implements an MCP or Toggle, time tracking, you'll be able to say to Claude Desktop, go to Toggle, see how much time I spent with all of my clients this week, and then queue up invoices for them in Zero. And all of the hard part to do that already exists today, all of the intelligence. The bit that doesn't exist today is an easy way for Claude Desktop to connect to those things, and that's what MCP is.
Cool, that was a really great description. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Steve, for that. I think from a practical perspective as well, I think for people that are building in this space, it's just having a set way of doing this means that you can do things in a correct way, which I don't think we've had so far. And I think what this really allows for also is the fact that if one person builds things on one side, someone else can use it. And I think that's why the speed of this is just really going to accelerate. So I've seen a lot of different styles of MCPs coming out now, one with Figma, one with being able to tap into the browser and that kind of thing. Ultimately, they'll all be combined together to take this, all of what we've done, to the next level. So I think that's what I'm excited about with them.
Just for the novice here, are MCPs, I thought that they were only something that existed in Cursor?
So MCPs were invented by Anthropic, who are one of the big AI labs that are the AI lab behind Claude. So they basically wanted their LLMs, their AIs that they were inventing, to be able to interact more with the world. So they wanted to let their large language model, Claude, talk to and do more and more things. So as opposed to inventing all of those things themselves, they created this model context protocol to be able to let third-party developers create things that their AI can interact with. So that's where it comes from. And one of those applications is Cursor, to do that sort of stuff. And you can use model context protocols within Cursor and also call them from Cursor as well to get your app to be able to do other things. But the people who invented them were Anthropic, and that's quite I think a bit of an insight into this space. So it's got the backing of one of the big labs, basically.
And it's almost like Anthropic's invented the USB port for language models, really.
Yeah. If you want to visualize what an MCP looks like in practice, it looks like search or code interpreter or deep research and how they're integrated into ChatGPT. So that's the type of way you'd expect it to expose. At a technical level, really all it's doing is listening for function calls. So I realize that doesn't help make things clearer for the average listener. But if we go back, you think of ChatGPT before ChatGPT had search and before ChatGPT had code interpreter, you just had chat. And then you add in those capabilities and it knows it's got those and it can tap into them. And MCP is a way of any company exposing their functionality into an LLM, such that the LLM knows what's on the other end and how and when to invoke it.
So it is very much like, actually thinking about what ChatGPT's equivalent is. It's very much like they put their marketplace of kind of apps up there that did different connections to different things, where it almost feels a bit like Anthropic's way of doing it is to make it a bit more open and have everyone contribute to it. Is that right? Is that how everyone feels that it is?
Yeah, I don't think it's a million miles. Zapier never released what they did as a protocol per se, but if you think of like the way that Zapier, I'm pretty certain that if you're a company, if you're Airtable and you want to be able to integrate with Zapier, which you definitely would if you were Airtable, then you expose your API to Airtable through a certain interface. And that means that in Zapier, you can then go in, you can say insert stuff or when rows change, do this. And so Zapier essentially defined a protocol for that then these other places like Tray.io and so on plugged into, or Nation, is it? I can't remember. But once you've defined that once, it becomes a protocol that anybody else can plug into, and all of the other automation suites can take advantage of it. And essentially what MCP is, it does require everybody to go and produce their own MCP server. It's just the protocol, but it says that, look, if you do this, then, and we popularize it sufficiently, then everybody else should take advantage of it. It's actually the type of thing that would genuinely do well as a crypto coin. Protocols do suit coins, but they're too legitimate to be used as coins.
Yeah. But the point is, you don't have to use MCPs. So just to be absolutely clear, MCPs aren't just to be used by Claude, are they? It's a protocol that anyone can communicate with.
Yeah, so, and just to get it, just to be super clear, given that it's expanding around everywhere. So there's two things. There's the MCP, which is the protocol, which is a bit like HTTP. And then there's an MTP server, which is the thing that you expose your API through, which the LLM then connects to. Right. So it's like saying back in the day, you've got the whole of your ERP system and all of your inventory, but people can't get to it. So you have an HTTP server along with the REST protocol that allows people to get to it. And MCP is just that protocol that sits in the middle. And so what we're starting to see crop up is what we will see as companies produce, if it becomes successful, we'll see companies expose their own APIs via MCP. Yeah. And what we're currently seeing is third parties go in and build MCP servers for these companies that you as a developer can then run. So it's like early days of the web. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, that's really interesting. And so we're getting to a point now. So it feels like what we're getting to a point of is I go on my chat or whatever, and I just say to it, I'm running out of milk, and then it will then go, hey, you know what? I'm gonna tap into Ocado. I'm gonna go and do this. Oh, while you're at it, it looks like maybe you need a new milk jug. If it takes over, if it's using Claude 3.7, my house will be full of random stuff I didn't ask for. But having said that, it will then go out and tap into all these different MCP servers and do whatever I want to, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is pretty important for this whole area. If you take a step back and look on how APIs really transformed a lot of applications and cloud applications. So take a step back. We've casually bantered around Zapier, which helps to plug together APIs. But basically, when the mobile phone came along and everyone's in the cloud, APIs were the thing that people began to realize, hold on a second, I've got this app that's currently now delivered on a browser on my cloud application, but now I want a mobile app. Oh, that's a bit more awkward. Hold on a second. I need to have another database that mounts that. Actually, I need that mobile app to talk to the same database. So that was some of the places where APIs began to get pretty common and pretty open. And then people began to have the requirements. I want the third-party app to begin to access my service or a feature in my service. And that's where APIs began to explode. And that's one of the key tailwinds that drove the adoption of Slack. So everyone goes, oh, Slack is the best communication tool, blah, blah, blah. Nonsense. We launched a really good chat system in the late 90s from our investment banking desk because it was really good and we needed to build one, and we built one of the best ones in the world, and it was really very good. And that was very tightly integrated, but it didn't really explode until, because you had Skype, and Skype is a really good chat system as well
Yeah.
for groups as well, long before Slack. So why did Slack explode? The key thing that Slack did, it was very subtle, and I think most people don't appreciate it, is Slack let you communicate not just with the people in your team, but also with your applications in your team. So you can start to get a message from your help desk application when a user came up with a query, or you could get a net notification from your another system, such as when an invoice was paid or when an order was placed on your system, these sorts of things. So those APIs into those other applications began to come into Slack to help people do their work, if you like, as well. So not only was it a communication between you and your people, but also between you and your applications, and Slack did that really well. And that was APIs. That was like a good layer on top of all the APIs that have been developed and continue to be developed a lot. And there's lots of good things out there that does that. But I think that's what this MCP protocol is, and we're beginning to see the start of it. It's equivalent for that for large language models and how it can plug in to other applications. And that's probably a good way to think about it in this sort of context, I think.
That's just something that I'm trying to mentally get my head around. Is that APIs, like I've played around with Make and Zapier. So more or less my definition of an API is like a bridge or a funnel where you can pass information between different software or different programs. How is an MCP different? Like what is it?
Yeah, I think that it's a really good question, because I'm trying to get my head around it as well, to be honest. But I think this is a protocol that is for LLM to LLM comms, basically. And I think that adds an extra level of what you need to do with it, basically. So an API is very set in terms of, this is my endpoint. I'm going to add a candidate, I'm going to remove a candidate, or I'm going to delete a candidate, whatever it may be. I think the magic with it, and if it was just an if it was just an API protocol, then going to your chat of saying do something, and it will just go to a very rigid, I'm going to add a candidate. Whereas I think with MCPs, there's a slight difference, because there's a level of intelligence before or now and after your signal. And I think everyone's finding their feet as to where the intelligence goes in this. Like, yeah. So
can I jump in with that, David? There's no implication with an MCP that there's any intelligence on the other side.
No.
So it's just, to your question, Lizzie, which is a very good question, it is effectively just an API. What it really is a standard for describing the API. It's a standard for describing the API in a way that essentially what's happening is that the description of the API is literally being pasted into the chat in advance of you starting the chat. And so it's just pasting in the whole thing in a format that the LLM is tuned to understand, which in OpenAI, they call it function calling. Anthropic, MCP, like, comes to the same thing. And it's a way of the API describing what each method does and what each parameter that you need to pass to it, what parameters are expected, such that the LLM builds an awareness of what its capabilities are. But it's literally just a description of a normal API that gets pasted into the context before the chat.
So the magic...
There's a little bit more than that as well, actually, Peter, because it has an awareness of state through this. So it's not just an endpoint request and then back again like you get for an API. An API endpoint was, give me this data from my database and I'll give you back a load of data. I think there's a little bit of also in terms of state management where it can track back and forth communications as well. So that is embedded within the MCP as well as just what you said. You're not incorrect in what you said. That extends it a little bit more though, the state management element, because in a conversation, in a chat type conversation, there's multiple stages back and forth, if you like. That's where the context comes into the MCP, the model context protocol. That's where the contexty bit comes into it as well. That makes sense.
Sure. I'm not convinced about that, Glenn. Because I didn't think MCP, one of the things I looked up is, I don't think, first off, it doesn't deal with the context at the front end. So the context at the front end in the chat is still managed by the chat application as normal. I don't think, like when I looked it up, MCP doesn't actually even deal with authentication.
I think you're probably right in exactly what, because I haven't read it up, exactly what MCP, the structure is like, and what the protocol is. But I think what the implementations of it that I'm seeing now take it one step further. So take it to the point of either and I think this is the interesting part, is when you're implementing it, you don't, on one side, the kind of LLM giving out the command, has a view of how it's going to use those MCPs. So there's that. So for example, if I'm searching Jira for a ticket, I could just search Jira for, I'm looking for a ticket about authentication, right? I could just do that. Or I could decide as a programmer that I'm going to search for every variation of authentication in that. Here we go. I told you about the light, didn't I? But I'm going to search for every version of authentication in the Jira tickets. Like I'm going to search for authentication, SSO, everything that it may be. So I think that's where this thing is going to get exciting, because you've got a language model calling it, and then the people who actually who create the MCP servers have also got the opportunity to have a language model like calling it, because we're naturally developing in them anyway. So on the other side of them anyway. So I feel that's where like the innovation is going to come from, actually, is how you use those standard protocols. It might well be a standard protocol, but I think when they're getting built being sandwiched in language and translation.
So pull up, actually, if you go into Anthropic and ask Anthropic, what is model console protocol, they invented it and they got some good stuff in that. So one of the three core concepts around it are structured communication format, which is what we've just been talking about. It's like an API. Here's the structure of the data transfer. But the second thing is context awareness, and it enables models to maintain the awareness of the conversation history, the user preferences, and task requirements within the context of the conversation, and preserving that context across multiple interactions, not just one interaction. So with an API endpoint, it's generally a one-point interaction. There's a message that goes in, it's received in the right format, it does a job, it runs a task in the server where the API receives the message, and then it sends that message back as a one-off, singular two-directional communication. A request for information, send information back. That's it, all over. An API doesn't do anything beyond that. That will be the definition of an API. These model context protocols are trying to do something more than that. They're remembering multi-hop journeys, and they are remembering state through those protocol interactions. And that's a key part of what this does. And then the third thing that the model context protocol does capability declaration. So that explicitly communicates the abilities and limitations of what a given endpoint or a given server can do. And that helps to manage task routing in different jobs in the future. Because basically the idea of this at the bigger picture is that there's multiple capabilities exposed via these MCP servers. So one might be to go back to milk in David's example from earlier on. I'm going to try to roll with this because it's not necessarily the best example, but I'm going to go with it. Okay, we have an MCP that is attached to a camera in David's kitchen. He comes through and say, okay, I'm out of milk in the kitchen, or is a voice command that says, hey, I'm out of milk, and it goes back and goes, okay, what is that going to mean? Maybe there's somewhere looks up, where can I get milk? Blah blah blah, and it was like, okay, what are David's preferred shops? Maybe he's got that stored somewhere and exposed in an MCP server. Goes, all right, David likes to shop at Sainsbury's or Ocado or whatever it might be. Do we have an account there? Oh yeah, we have an account there. I have those credentials. I'm going to go off now and make that order. So the model itself, the original instruction, can do multiple steps, multiple tasks across multiple MCP endpoints, and string those things together and keep the context through all of that of the original output or request from David, which was, I'm out of milk, can you order me some more?
Well, you know what? I'm just out of the milk thing. Let's take the milk thing a bit further. Are we getting to a point where I've authenticated Ocado, and Ocado will just literally go and check if there's milk in my fridge? Do you know what I mean? And then saying, actually, you've got no milk in your fridge, David. Is that where this is going? Is that what? You know,
I feel like we're a little way off from that yet.
No, and given the fact that the Samsung fridge that will order your milk for you has been talked about for about 10 years now, I think the technology has existed a little bit more for that. It still hasn't really happened. So I think
it feels like there's a drive now, because everyone can develop a lot faster. These protocols are coming out. It feels like we are now at the point where this is all going to happen. All those things we've been talking about. This is what I'm excited about at the moment, is it feels like all of these things can suddenly happen now. Like, it's like the biggest limitation for all of us. It's so funny, you know, a tangential thing. But in my business, I just see now that my team, who would have feared writing emails and feared writing big plans and sign-off emails, I had one this week, there's no fear anymore. They do it within 15 minutes. They've now got, it would have taken them 4 hours before. They've now got 3 hours, 30, 45, if I can do my maths, whatever extra, to do this kind of thing. It feels to me like we're in this point where we're just going to see all of this happen now. Yeah, and I don't know how everyone else feels like that, but it feels like this is those points where you've said we've been talking about Samsung fridges for 15 years. Yeah, we have. And all the ideas are already there. It's just now we've got like the capacity and the means to execute everything now.
Strangely enough, when I was in university, I was trying to make a product that it was essentially just to live a minimalist life. But essentially, I would have every item around me, so like a toaster or my fridge or my kettle or whatever. And if I didn't use it for 3 months, I wanted it to put itself on eBay and sell itself. And I tried as hard as I could to try and make this, but I couldn't. But now, like you guys are speaking, I'm like, actually, maybe you could actually plug in an MCP to get your toaster to sell itself if it's not used.
Yeah, it could definitely name itself, that's for sure.
It sounds to me a lot, and maybe this is just me bringing it down to my dumbass level, but it sounds to me like an advocate. It sounds like an API, but also with a lot of context and a bit of an advocate for you. So, for example, like talking about Mikado and milk, bringing it back to the milk again, it's, yeah, okay, I want to buy milk, but we like whole milk. It's like adding that extra
Killer
Wow.
use case right now. Oh my God, this is amazing. This is something I've just wanted for ages. And the killer use case for me is the anti-GDPR thing. So every website I go to, what I want in that website is, you know what? I don't want to give you all my data. I don't want to subscribe to all your marketing preferences. I want to cancel them all. If you need some pieces of information to run the website, okay, but that's the max of it. Just do that. Every single time I go to a website. How good was that be? That's a killer MCP take if the MCP could do that. MCPs can interact with browsers. I'm not sure can they take full control of the browser, but that would be the method. That could be if you could build that.
I can imagine a browser plugin with a Chrome plugin with an MCP on top in some way, yeah, that would steer it.
So the MCP is the alternative to this. So if you like, I think one of the things that, I mean, God, it's so weird that when you say used to, and you're like, I mean, 2 weeks ago. But when I heard Andrea Carpathy do a long interview when he was at Tesla, or talking about his time at Tesla, and he was head of AI at Tesla before going to OpenAI and before leaving again. And he said that Tesla had kept reducing back the number of sensors that they had. So they didn't use LiDAR and they didn't use radar. And part of that was a production engineering thing, because it's actually quite hard to get all of those out. And if any of them don't work, then you've got like a pipeline supply chain problem. But he also said, and I think from anybody else, you wouldn't be 100% whether this was insight or spin. But from Andre, I think like you only really get the truth. He said, we live in a world that was designed for vision. Like driving is designed for vision. So he said, you want the car to work with vision as the primary thing. And I think what's interesting about model context protocol, and it is, Glenn, it's just the server, it's just the description of the tools. Like it's up to the client how they use them. But the context protocol itself is actually, what it's done is we thought that AIs using the internet were going to end up leaning into this. They'll just use it how the humans use it. It'll be quicker for the AIs to just go and use the websites, hence things like computer use, than it will be to go any other way. And so we thought it was going to go that way. And what the MCPs have done is put a kink in that and said, no, actually, like they can just go directly to the APIs behind the scenes. And we've given them the content. In fact, that's a really good way of understanding it. If you think that an API on its own is quite a raw, hard thing to understand, if you sit a website, or to Glenn's point, a mobile app on top of an API, it produces loads of context and tells you intuitively how to use OpenTable or Airbnb or whatever you want to do. MCP is essentially the app that sits on, it's not essentially, but a way of visualizing it. It's the kind of UI and the interface that makes the API pretty and understandable by the LLM that's using it. And so it's actually the alternative to computer use. So computer use was like, we're not going to bother with APIs. We're just going to go and use the websites like we are humans. And MCPs has like thrown another turn and said, actually, if you expose your API through an MCP, it doesn't have to go through computer use, and it's way more efficient this way.
Am I right in saying, Pete, and I'm not sure because I need to experiment, but am I right in saying that one of the third part that Glenn mentioned there was the fact that it describes itself? So am I right in saying that it's very simple to just say, go and use for that? Can you just check out the Slack MCP and see if you can do something with it? And then the LLM will then go, oh, actually, I've seen that Slack has got all these options and I could search on these things. Yeah.
It's literally exactly that. So all it's essentially doing is it's saying you have these functions available to you. Like, it doesn't actually do anything with the functions, but it's saying, like, you've got, let's take OpenTable, right? It's saying you've got a find available restaurants or find restaurants by geocode method available. And when the user says, I want to find places in Soho on Friday that are Chinese, then it says to it, look, in order to find these restaurants, these are the parameters that I need. This is what they look like. And this is what you're going to have to send to me. And then the LLM knows that when I say this, how to translate my request into the exact text that it then pastes in and then sends off to the API. So it's a translation layer that takes my waffly, like, fuzzy request and translates it into something that's hard that can be pushed off to an API.
No, that is true, but the wrapper can have important parts in it, can't it? So the wrapper, I think we're probably seeing now a race to build the best MCP servers that wrap around APIs, basically. So in a way where, for example, like I said earlier about Jira, asking for multiple variations of something from the API instead, or asking for something in a very specific way that someone has made that request that had a specific expertise so they know what the outcome is going to be. That's what I'm seeing out there at the moment is, for example, Chrome has some APIs, but someone's done a wrapper that says, I'm going to have it so this is my browser API, so I'm going to show you console logs, I'm going to do some screenshots. You know, so it's that race to build those MCP servers. And it sounds like there's not really much of these MCP, doesn't feel like they're monetizing them in any way, but it feels like that's what we're seeing a lot being built of. Every time I go on Twitter now, or X, there's like literally, it's probably just the algorithm, to be honest, but they're just talking about MCPs, all these different use cases of MCPs at me. And they all seem like slightly different takes, even if it's the same API. You see what I mean?
I don't really think there's nothing fundamentally about MCP that adds anything to that adds anything to the API that wasn't already there. Like, a nice way of thinking about it is like GraphQL versus REST, right? And if you just wanted to stick a GraphQL interface, like if you wanted to get some sort of converter and you've got a REST API and you want to stick GraphQL on it, that's essentially what's happening here. I don't think we're going to see intermediary stuff, but it does describe the functionality that's there, and then it will be down to Jira to produce other endpoints and expose them through MCP, such that you can do more interesting things with Jira than you could before.
Why would you not?
I want to dive in there and jump on something Peter said a little bit at the bow. He said it very casually and in passing, but it's actually super, super important. And he goes, you said you're gonna take my fuzzy request and translate it into the API request in a way, and that actually is deeply untrivial. If you look at, and this is one that I've been reading something in the last few weeks about what is an LLM, and there's a good article I read on the fact that an LLM could be viewed as another type of computer, a different type of computer than we've been traditionally used to for the last 50 years. Let me give you an example. A traditional computer, I need to do the calculation of 5 plus 5. What does that equal? Or more accurately, how many R's are there in strawberry? Simple traditional computer can do that job really well. But someone asked me this question today, actually. I want to be able to look at an image of a restaurant and get a feel for the vibe of that restaurant. What sort of experience am I going to have there, right? Ask a traditional computer that question, forget about it, right? The traditional computer does not have a clue about how to do that. Whereas an LLM, asking how many R's in strawberry, and famously it gets that wrong quite a lot, or the early models definitely did without any of the thinking overlays on it. But ask the LLM, what do you think the vibe of this restaurant is? What sort of a night would I have out there, or meal would I have there if I went along to that with a business colleague or with my partner or whatever it might be, right? So in those sort of ways, these fuzzy questions are well suited to LLMs. Now, to go back to what Peter said, that the MCP is a mechanism to help translate that fuzzy requirement into the detailed requirement needed for a protocol interface like an API. That's actually quite a hard and very non-trivial task. To give you another good example of that, we were talking about that today with the Quadrum Institute in the UK, which I was chatting to. They supply the UK's food database, right? So these are the guys, when you say this is the standard of, this is how many calories there are in a piece of chicken, those are the guys that produce that for the UK. Now, that is how that traditional way of what's in a meal or in a piece of food is, and what's on the contents when I scan a barcode of what's the calories and nutrition of that, those come from those traditional databases and by those traditional API endpoints. And that is an absolute thing. I've said it's this item, and therefore this is the result that gets back. When what we do in the field at the moment is, as a counterexample to that, is we're taking a picture of something and we're getting out its estimate of what items are on the plate, but it's actually going to say the word chicken in multiple different ways that are all relevant. And when we look at it as humans, we completely get, right? It goes, oh, that's roast chicken, that's a chicken leg, that's a chicken breast, that's, all these different things to refer to the same sort of thing that we all know is that, and that all translates back into chicken in database. But that mapping, really hard. It's a really hard problem in computer science to do those mappings. We have complex protocols to try to do that, and we're getting better with graph models and stuff like that at the moment. But large language models are able to take that fuzziness and begin to help in those sort of processes. And I think that's an important aspect of what we're talking about here. And just to follow up on what Pete says, it takes this fuzzy request and turns it into, I fancy an Indian tonight, and I fancy something medium hot and lamb. Okay. And how does that translate that into an order at my local Indian restaurant? That is the key thing there, I think.
So are we going to have, so just a quick question out there, really, are we going to, because I completely get Pete's point about it is literally just a protocol, and it's going to expose endpoints. But then on top of that, we're all now given the opportunity to build those front end LLMs that are using MCP servers like in the background to get anything. And then on top of that, we could be an MCP server ourselves, so we can give access to kind of people to use all of that amazing intelligence that goes and does all of that stuff that you just said, Glenn, gets different things in different places and presents it to them. So it feels like there's the innovation layer then, is how you use those MCPs and effectively give that out as value to the end user at that point. Is that where we see this all being built up then in that way?
Just curious, like spinning off of that, do you imagine that there's going to end up being like one MCP server to rule them all that plugs into everything else?
It's going to the direction where we'll end up, I want to buy the real top one because it taps into with all the right intelligence into all of them. Like
So I think you're almost there, but there's another interesting question to this. There's just one word different, which is a universal MCP client. So it's what we're talking about here is a browser, basically. We're talking about like a browser that an LLM can use to use all of these different tools. And so back in the day, you had lots of computers, like in different universities primarily, and different defense installations. They couldn't talk to each other, and so you put this protocol over them, or research, they put the web over them and HTTP, and then they could talk to each other. That's what MCP has done. And your browser in the world of MCP is your chat client, or whatever kind of equivalent you want to put on the chat client. But there is, to your point, Lizzie, there's actually an interesting question that comes with MCPs, because as these descriptions of the API are verbose, and they go into the chat, so they go in advance of, like when you load up your new chat, in advance of you starting to write anything, the description of the API has been put into it, and it's quite a long description, which means that you can't put an indefinite number of these in. You can't have the chat just by default be aware of the whole of the internet, because there would just be too much context to paste into the chat. So these will almost certainly be developing hand in hand with agents, and the job of the agent will be at a level above the MCP to understand your intent and to know what components, what functions, which is essentially what these are, what tools to load in according to your query. So if you go in and you're like, okay, what were last month's results, and like how do they like correlate with our support requests? Like it will know, right, fine, we need to load in data from Stripe, maybe some data from Mixpanel and some data from your support system. Whereas if you go on, you say, I want to book a restaurant in Soho on Friday, it's going to load in the stuff from OpenTable. So at the moment, the direction it's going, and all bets are off in this space to predict anything past 6 weeks, basically. But at the moment, the way it's going is that the nature of these protocols is that they will need something sitting on top of them to know when to load them in and when to detach them again.
Yeah, and I think that's the opportunity here, right? So I don't think there will be this like one to rule them all in this particular thing. This is a tool set of a lot of different tools that people are going to be able to use in different ways. And I think that's massively an egalitarian thing and an opportunity for lots of people to do lots of tiny little things. I think this is, as opposed to one master thing, quite the opposite. I think it's going to be a huge amount of people doing a lot of stuff because all of a sudden now they can without too much complexity when they plug into these things. And I think therefore the way people create apps and agents that sit on top of them. So apps that will maybe recruit agent or multiple agents, which will in themselves be able to recruit multiple MCPs in the background. They bring all those things back together into an app type interface, or that to be delivered over on a screen or via voice or whatever it might be. And I think there needs to be that control layers that sit on top, agents and app control and agents that control that access and use MCPs as tools. There you go. Does that make sense?
That completely makes sense, but I still think it sounds like it results in one that rules them all, because you've got one at the top that has access to all the agents, that then has access to other agents or other MCPs, whatever you want to say. So it feels like it might end up with one that rules it all, right? So it might end up with do you see what I mean? So it feels, I can imagine Apple being the one that rules it all. I mean, annoyingly for Apple use. I know.
We've
I
all
know
come to imagine.
Recently, not my view of
I've
the
got a
future.
big imagination. Yeah.
By the way, I only learned this 2 weeks back, and as soon as I tell you it, you're going to kick yourself. But do you know why LLMs find it really hard to count the number of R's in strawberry?
No.
I'm dying to know.
It's the same problem as me asking you to count the number of sevens in strawberry. Does that give you a clue, Glenn?
Yeah, a little bit. That's quite interesting, actually, when you think about it.
The reason LLMs find it really hard to count the number of R's in strawberry is not that they're stupid, is they don't see letters. LLMs only see tokens. All letters are converted into tokens before going into the LLM. So they don't have any concept of letters. It's like me asking you how many sevens are in strawberry. If you break strawberry down into the UTF encoding of each of the letters, then you get a number of different numbers, including 8 sevens. But me asking you that as a question is just nonsensical to you, because you're like, all right, there are no sevens in strawberry. But there are if you go to the underlying encoding. And that's why LLMs can't struggle to count letters in things. So what's happened over time is, I think literally they have built up training sets to teach them by rote, the same way that we learn our times tables, how to spell. Like the LLMs have been taught how to spell expressively. They can't do it empirically.
But again, at all of these things, it's using the right tool for the job, right? It goes back to what's a traditional computer, and they do some tasks really well, better than LLMs. But the LLMs is a new paradigm, and it's just new. It does things in a different way, and it's got the ability to do fuzzy logic in a way that traditional computers just couldn't. And the fuzzy logic's key because the world's quite fuzzy in general, and therefore it feels like it's intelligence all of a sudden in a way that just being able to calculate a colossal number and do a colossal piece of math that we would really struggle with as humans as well felt very smart but very robotic in a way. Coming into LLMs now does the interface into the fuzzy grayer world of humanity in real life, and that's why this all of a sudden feels intelligent. And I think that's where the intelligence comes from, the artificial intelligence and all this stuff. And the other interesting bit is, as Pete builds up, it goes back into that underlying encoding where we begin to, it goes back into your question. I thought what you were saying there when you said about number sevens in strawberry, Peter, was around I think there's a link between the object caret and 7 as well. So it's one of those things that there's a famous test where you give you a number and you go through it. It always ends up in caret. I think caret and 7 are stored in the same sort of storage area within human brains. There's a couple of things like that. When you get to a certain level, they're stored in the same reference section in the brain. And when you begin to think of the brain does things like that, I think LLMs are doing something that's really remarkably very similar to that. There's associations between things that we build up over time, and connection strengths and those sort of things, and that's get bigger and bigger. All of a sudden we're getting to the same sort of magnitude of the amount of neurons in the human brain now with these huge parameters that we got. And that's why we're just getting really close to that. It's taken us years and years to get anywhere near to the magnitudes, but we're now very nearly there, hence why this is emerging. And David,
can I just ask a question, maybe just because it's something that I'm interested in? MCPs must have been around for a few weeks, few months, whatever. They've obviously hit some critical mass now, and everyone's going absolutely insane and building applications on them at any rate. Is there anything else like that is ticking along at the moment that I'm unaware of that I should be knowing about while we've got all of us in the room that read these things?
I just think it's like deep state. I think there's what a trains, yeah.
What a train, much more
What a
existential
trains.
What are MCPs? What are MCPs? Answer that.
But I don't actually think there's much genuine. It's just Twitter is now a massive market for anything to do with AI. And you saw everyone like blow up on DeepSeek. I was like, how much is there to DeepSeek? Like it was cheaper, like it was open source. They did interesting stuff. But could you do anything differently as a result of DeepSeek? Basically, no. But Twitter is just starving for information.
And even with that, I think the whole conversation around DeepSeek based on the cost of its output was also just nonsense, because Gemini was already cheaper than DeepSeek. It was just, does no one know the price of the Gemini? How come the whole internet doesn't know the price of the Gemini? It's publicly available knowledge. There only is 4 or 5 large LLMs out there. Do you not know that this is already cheaper than DeepSeek? This is a bit of a nonsense back and forth that we were having.
But your point.
Yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Sorry, I was just, you were asking a really interesting question, David. It's like, what's the current sleeper?
Yeah, exactly. And certainly not your child, that's for sure. But
Trains, didn't you hear? It was trains.
yeah, exactly. But no, because so that's interesting, Pete. So after the end of all of this and the whole hour, you think this will blow over the next couple of weeks then?
No, I think it's super interesting. I just think there's a massive disparity between all of these people that we see on Twitter, like doing threads where number 7 will blow your mind.
Yeah.
There's just a massive disparity between the market for that type of information and the substance. And I think MCPs are really useful, but I'm really interesting and it's a really good protocol. But we all know we know how far we are on the cutting edge of things, and even amongst ourselves we weren't that clear about what an MCP was. Most of Twitter is just like, there's a market for information, I'll publish noise, the noise machine continues.
Yeah,
but I think that's an interesting question, Sleeper. Sorry, Glenn.
The idea is if you get something good now, it can go from 0 to massive awareness very quickly and back into obscurity again, I think, equally quickly. I think we were pointing some of those things out. Who's now talking about X, Y, Z? And there's definitely a few of those things that are there. I do think MCPs are important because they feed into that wrapper layer. And I think there's more value. Everyone talks about the models, the latest things that OpenAI can do, this GPT release or Claude or whatever it might be. And I think people still underestimate how important the wrapper layer of that all is. We've talked today, I think, some interesting conversations today on our big chat on the fact that is Anthropic trying just to solve code really properly and disintermediating some of the code wrappers that we've been using a lot that sit on top of it. That might be the case, especially for coding, because it's such an important thing. The theory that if you get coding correct, then you can build artificial general intelligence and you've solved everything else. So that's a good reason why coding might be the thing that they just focus their skills on. And that's a good argument for that. But beyond that, there's going to be a lot of things that the big AI labs are not going to try to do, ordering your takeaway, etc., or doing something novel with that, right? We all know the idea of that, but what's going to be the thing that really is a killer application that sits on top of all these things? We don't really know. That's one of the things. It'll look like it's something that we're probably not going to anticipate right now. But we do know there's going to be surprising things coming along.
I think what we can say is that this is just another thing that will speed up software development more, because having more standard things out there allowing you to connect to more of these things is only going to speed things up. We might see another shift of speed, Pete, if you agree with that. It's possible that you could see now I can go into Jira and it's already someone's already basically pre-written that wrapper for that API on that LLM. And now I can go into Slack and do it without having to integrate. Someone else has already done the hard work. It feels like then it gives us the opportunity to then build. So maybe this is just another thing that makes building quicker and easier. And that might be the result of it rather than MCP itself. It might be the applications that come of it are the powerful thing rather than that itself.
Do you think that there'll be an MCP that can help write MCPs? So help like people like me who don't know how to code actually make those?
It sorts you out completely. This is exactly right. You just hopefully just say, connect to Slack and sort me out.
It's the opposite of that, in that you won't have to write MCP servers like any more than you'd have to. Oh my God, it's all happening here. Sorry, he's just knocked up this standing desk. And
Look at it going up.
so you won't have to
You
write
could have nailed
MCP
that.
servers.
You could have just stood up slowly during it at the same time, and we would never
I
have
do
noticed.
that sometimes, yeah. But you won't have to write MCP servers any more than you'd have to write your own Zapier. Like, it's the opposite of that by somebody exposing through MCP. I think what's really interesting is we're just going to see chat become, assuming people lean into it, and also assuming OpenAI leans into it, because if OpenAI doesn't embrace it, then for 98% of people, it's going to be academic anyway. But we're just going to see the chat interface become more and more powerful, be able to say more and more stuff to the chat interface and it just do it.
I think it's an interesting thing you say that OpenAI don't embrace it. Like, OpenAI are obviously the brand name in the space for everyone out there in the world that has an LLM. The vast majority of them are using ChatGPT still, etc. Claude is just like 2% of the market or something like that. It's definitely a lot smaller. For coders, the opposite actually. I would nearly argue that Claude is the biggest coding protocol that the guys on the edge use now a lot, and that's an important thing. But it might be interesting, Pete, that MCP is the ability for the Anthropic engine to open source this connectivity layer. And even though OpenAI might try to resist that, the open protocol of something like MCP servers will maybe be forced for OpenAI to embrace that, to connect to all these things. Because at the moment, I'm not sure OpenAI have an alternative option rather than MCP. So if I'm an application owner and want to expose my OpenTable app to the world, I think I'm right in saying that MCP is probably it. Now, OpenTable is a big enough and an obvious enough use case. I think OpenAI have their direct app linkages in the OpenTable and stuff. But there's lots of other second tier, I would say, probably use cases that would want to open up and build their own MCP server and say, here it is, here's the endpoint, come and use it. And that might force the hand with OpenAI and MCP become the dominant one because it's the open one.
I mean, I really hope so. And I think also, like, I don't think they've got any reason to fight it. I mean, I think it only makes the chat interface more powerful, and I think it's in their own benefit. The only reason I said it takes them to embrace it is that 99% of people who are currently interacting with AI are interacting through ChatGPT.
It's interesting. What I'm thinking about when you're saying that is that people building are not necessarily if they're building stuff that relies on LLMs, they're not necessarily showing the chat interface to the end user. You know what I mean? A lot of the stuff that kind of powers like interfaces now will go to an LLM, do something and present something back. So it's almost like it's a different way of it's possibly a different way of even thinking about as a developer as to how I'm going to integrate with my APIs anymore, potentially. Because if you can actually do it in a much more simple way, where you didn't even have to build an API integration, you could have just gone to your LLM and MCP server and it's already got all of the way of talking about it. Might be there's actually a software layer underneath. There's a software layer underneath normal kind of UI and UX that is using MCPs. So it's Is that way too abstract? I don't know what I'm talking about anymore.
Actually, there's an app store called Fleur for model context protocol applications that sit on top of Claude, the Anthropic AI. So I had as we were in this, let me just quickly download Fleur. I researched it the other day. I said I better check that out. So when I was on the conversation here, I've downloaded it, and then I had to download the Claude for desktop. I usually just use it in the browser, so I downloaded that. Then it was like there was one for Hacker News, and I was like, okay, let's install this MCP in my Claude. I was like, ding, okay, that was quick. And then I was like, okay, search Hacker News for stories on MCPs on Hacker News. Now just in a Claude chat, boom, just give me back the answer to that. I went off and searched the third. I was like, so basically the long and short of that, Lizzie, is you can absolutely do this stuff in terms of hack. That was much easier than even Zapier. Oh my God. You can imagine doing a Zapier integration. I wouldn't have been able to do that.
Now, Glenn, there's no reason why you couldn't have your own server there, then that you'd already pre-built, then now your website now goes and pulls Hacker News. Do you know what I mean? Immediately. You don't even have to do anything now. That to me seems super powerful. That's unleashing a whole new speed of development in that way, potentially.
I think all right, so actually you were talking about Sleeper. I'll give you a Sleeper, which I don't think is a protocol, but I think it's an awakening.
Yeah.
We're not yet really seeing people build. We haven't really seen any LLM created interfaces yet. Now, chat's not the best interface to do loads of things through. Loads of things are better done through other interfaces. And we know that the LLMs can build software, but what I think we're going to start seeing is, and this goes slightly to your point, David, because it gets to your idea of what does your website do. If your website is interfacing with something else softly through an MCP protocol, then it's going to have some way of exposing that back to the user. So what does that look like? If we don't know what we're getting back, then we don't really know how we're going to display it. So if there's that softness on one side, it's got to be softness on the other side. So the easy way to deal with the softness on the user side is chat. That's the canonical way to do it. But the other way to do it, and this I think is a huge sleeper, and I think it's going to be super interesting when we start seeing stuff coming, is we're going to see dynamic interfaces built. And I think that you're going to start seeing the LLMs not give their response to you in text, but they're going to give it to you in an interface. And to some degree, arguably, that's already happening. So if you think of like the tables that ChatGPT can give you, that's an interface.
Yeah.
Actually, this is really interesting because I think this is a corollary to it. If you think of the MCP as being the server way of describing an API to the LLM that lets the API connect to the LLM, I think the opposite side of that is a way of the opposite side to that is a way of describing UI. So the LLM could, in theory, get into the API. It could write some code to get in, but it's just a mess. It can do it. We know it can do it because it can write code, but it's super messy. So MCP came along and said, here's a super clean way of describing the API that allows your LLM to understand and to take advantage of it. I think we're going to see the same on the client side. So I think we're going to see a protocol for describing UI, not dissimilar again to HTML, right? HTML was the other side to HTTP. So HTTP said, this is how you connect and how you send the data across. And HTML said, this is how you display it. And these were the kind of, was one other thing as well, but these were essentially the two components to the web. So I think that if we did see the continuation of MCP, what we would see is something that was a descriptive layer that made it simpler and easier for the LLM to render completely on the fly, describe the best UI for the problem, and to give you that UI rather than just a chat UI.
So that's really interesting. That's a brilliant thought, Peter.
That's absolute bingo. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting point of that is when I'm developing applications now, I'm spending more time on the user interface than I am on the code in the back end. So I think back end coders have more a threat at the moment sooner rather than later than the front end guys, because they don't have to worry about visual interface and worry about the human. They got a very specific job. I've got this information, need to translate it into this information, or need to call this API or this MCP now, etc. And so the back end guys and the code I've got for my back end is much more prescriptive and doesn't need much subtlety or creativity with it. When I'm designing the front end elements of my application, I spend a lot more time doing that, and the LLMs are not as good at it right now. It's definitely, they're getting better, and they're getting better fast as in all these things. But at the moment, that's a bit that they're less proficient at than the back end code, I would say, at this point in time. But I do think it's a direction of travel, and I do think that's a very evocative thing. Got to back this information. In this particular use case, I'm going to deliver one UX. In this other use case, with the same information or very similar, I'm going to give her a completely different UX to a slightly different user because they need to use it in a slightly different way. And that, I think, is a great idea. And I can see that being a thing. Actually, it's quite interesting.
I think also that is obviously the holy grail, isn't it? Where it's not even just about the right way. For example, when I'm designing a new designer, I call it designing, when I'm talking to a machine and I say to it, I want you to get in the mindset of the best UX designer, the best UI designer in the world, and come up with a concept of the new Meet the Team page or whatever it may be. But actually, I think the real part here is that once it knows me, imagine this, once it knows me, maybe voice is better for me, or maybe voice is better, so maybe my personal preferences then come into. So my browser is actually something that, I don't know if it's even going to be called a browser, but it knows me and knows how I like to consume information. I don't read as many books as I should, but I do listen to a lot of audiobooks because I find it easier to do that. And I can just imagine a point where actually, and this is what that personal assistant really is in the end, isn't it? When everyone's got that holy grail of a personal assistant, just presenting you the information the way that you need it. I don't like reading the big long chats. But then again, I do like type. I tried Super Whisper. I don't really like voice input as much as I like typing it as much because I can't form my thoughts, but that's me, and other people have it a different. So I can just imagine the interactions being the UX being completely customized to the user as well, on top of all of that. So a layer of that too. There we go, Pete. You got it.
That's a big thought. Yeah. There you go, Pete.
Yeah.
I think that is a big thought, Peter. There you go.
Yeah.
If you think so interestingly, like, I'll leave you with parting thoughts. Like, actually, lots and lots of UI comes down to quite simple paradigms, right? We have a calendar UI, we have like email, like lists, and then open something comes up on the right. You've got spreadsheet UI. Those different things, like whenever you're designing, you're thinking within, generally, like your design process is, don't reinvent the wheel. Like, you're not Snap, and users aren't going to understand what's going on. And turned out they didn't even really understand what was going on with Snap either, right? But you need to decide on one of these paradigms, and there's not that many of them. There's like news feeds, and there's magazine layouts, and so on. But there's not that many of them. And so actually, if you think of that, and we don't, frankly, as users, we just much rather something was easy to use than had all the design put into it. But if you start thinking about that, and then you're engaging with the LLM, maybe it's an architectural LLM, and part of it is you need to give you the dimensions, and it just thinks, I'm going to give you a spreadsheet, and you just put everything in, and the tabular thing is the right interface. Then the LLM is talking to you and saying, okay, so how do you envision the outside? And it just decides on the fly to give you some kind of a paint Photoshop interface, and it gives you up the image and then gives you a spray and anything else. And then finally, it's okay, these are the things that we need to run through, and it renders a to-do list, or it's here are the different options you'll paint, and it renders a news feed. Yeah. I think we're going to see those different UI elements popping out, because chat definitely isn't optimal.
Maybe Duolingo, maybe everything in life will just be a game. I'll just literally have my interface, and I'll just do this, and then you'll do this, and you'll be able to pay your mortgage. Do this, you'll be able to, like, literally everything a little game until the end of it.
Yeah, there's the matrix right there. Okay.
I like the idea of, well, I don't know if I like it actually when I think about it a bit more, but I mean, in terms of marketing and advertising and stuff, you could build a profile of everybody, like, I don't know, give them a cookie or something like that, and go, okay, yeah, this person is really into environmentalism. So on your website or whatever you have, okay, yeah, that the focus of everything dynamically changes to fit that user. Look, we're environmentally friendly. We have this X, Y, and Z. Yeah, that kind of completely dynamic UI, I can imagine as well being like,
there's a YC company that's doing that at the moment, and I don't know fully to what degree they were like a very early user. They had early access to GPT-4, and I don't know what degree, but I think they are basically rewriting large sections. It was along those lines basically, and they were rewriting the website. You know how people will change the title to match the title of the page to match the headline that they're using in their Google AdWords. So there's resonance when you land. I think it was going much deeper than that, just as you were suggesting, Lizzie. I think there's a lot in that.
my mind has been absolutely blown by this conversation. Like,
yeah. Mind something blown protocol. There we go.
Yeah.
Mine corrupted.
Mine completely
protocol.
Mine completely popped.
Mine completely popped. There we go. That is it. Very good, Peter. That's it. We got it.
Awesome. So shall we give it a wrap there? Any last closing
great.
thoughts?
That's it. There we go.
No, I really like that. That was really interesting to me. Thanks for your time. Thanks, Pete, for all your knowledge. And that was great for me.
Cool. If you think of the web was basically, I think, 3 things, maybe 4. So the web was HTTP. I think it was IP, or I'm not sure if IP existed prior to the web. It was DNS, and it was HTML. And those were the key things that basically allowed the interconnection of everything and the standards. And so with this, I think HTTP, DNS broadly, like you can assume kind of an IP already there. They're shared between the two of these. But what we've got now is this, I don't know, I've lost. Glenn, can you finalize? I'm not sure if I can.
No, I think your general thought is there's the back end information that's coming back to you. It's all those text coming there. How do you interpret that in the end user? The browser did that, right? So we had Mosaic and Netscape, and then
the browser created this subset of stuff where you could, if you were building a native piece of software, you could build literally anything you wanted and then connect it to the internet and do any interface. But the browser just went, you get tables. You don't even get CSS back in the day. You get some fonts and colors, you get select boxes and forms, and it gave you this subset of stuff, which was super limiting, but actually super empowering because everyone was on the same page and then everyone started creating with it. And I think that we are yet to get the HTML equivalent for the LLMs.
And it's not, and at the moment, it's just not, these LLMs aren't quick enough to be able to do it at the speed that they need to, actually. So I think also there's a hardware and speed thing there too, that when they can churn this stuff out quick enough, then I don't know what you mentioned, Peter, about it being a subset of, just final thought about being a subset of 6 different kind of formats or whatever, or 10 different formats, whatever it may be, and you just present the right one. I think the users' expectations have gone up way more than that now. I think it has to be well thought out UX design, like nicely formatted. Do you know what I mean? I don't think it's just as simple as
that, David. Because the baseline is not apps. The competition for this new interface layer is not apps, it's chat. Because chat is the interface to the LLM at the moment. This is not lifting you up from what the web delivers. That's still going to be there.
So my experience with Fueled, having built the app on top of the LLMs, that's not a chat interface. My interface is very crafted to be ideally placed to interpret what are the foods in this photograph? What is the nutritional breakdown of the foods in this photograph? I have a very complex UX we built with LLMs driving at the back end and not a chat interface inside. So
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the apps won't still have complex interface and we won't still build them. If you're wanting to deliver a new service, if the LLMs understand the context, how to connect to the server, and the LLMs know how to build the interface on the fly on the front end, you're going to see that people expose completely different things. You're going to see APIs spring up where there weren't APIs before, because the person exposing the API won't ever have to build the interface. They just have to expose the API.
Well, you've got that already with Twilio, right?
How do you mean?
It was an API company, right? Doesn't exist. There's no application that you have in Twilio. Everyone uses Twilio in their own apps, right? So Twilio and Stripe are both famously the 2 API first companies that were created 15 years ago, right? So they were the companies that jumped on board the API train and said, we don't need to build an app. We don't need to build an interface. We just need to build our functionality really well and expose a really good API and let everyone else consume that how they want. And that's how it's going to work.
No, I agree with that. But what I'm saying is something slightly different. What I mean is that somebody can, let's take like the local leisure centre. Now, these days they do have a website, but let's say they didn't. Like if the LLM has the context protocol to be able to connect to the server, and it has which like tells it how to take advantage of these functions and so on, and also it has the ability to render stuff on the client and the knowledge of how to do that, and it can do that effectively on the fly. That means that in order for the local leisure centre to expose the booking system for the squash courts, it never has to build the website. It only needs to expose the API, and the LLM will literally build you a nice like booking form and payment form, and it'll show what stuff's available, and it'll give you a calendar. Like I'm saying that at a very raw level, exposing an application to users at the moment means both front end and back end development. What this could ultimately mean is that like you don't have to do, I'm not saying that you won't have to do front end development, just literally by exposing the API, this thing will figure out what lives on the front end and will generate it for you.
Yeah, I can see that happening. That for sure. I was texting one of my friends about normal business ideas, that kind of thing. And I just said to him, he mentioned exactly that. He said, look, every website that has an API on it, often they're really impossible to use, et cetera, et cetera. There's not even a playground for them. Why don't a possible business idea would be to just write them the front end for it and like a playground for their API, and you could do that and sell it to them. You know, that was quite, and I thought, oh, that's quite a fun idea. You know, that these things are going through people's heads, I think. But I think this whole thing of dynamic on the back end, dynamic on the front end, like we've seen dynamic on the back end, but we haven't yet seen like dynamic on the front end. And I think you're right that when they are both dynamic and on the fly, then some magic is going to happen, and that's what I'm expecting now. Yeah.
But one more thought: there are a bunch of websites out there that don't have APIs and are quite hard to integrate with, and are terrible to use. Like to your point, David, about like writing business opportunity with MCPs, right? This is going on another step. If you were to, now we're 2 steps down the line, and by the time you're 2 steps down the line, like it's like a double pendulum, like you're just like making stuff up. But since we're 2 steps down the line, if you think of things that are like traditionally hard to do, but you'd like wouldn't necessarily bother to build like the niche services around them. Let's say you've got, here's a great one, Glenn, right up your street, Citi. So Citibank have got this like horrendous interface that meant that they accidentally sent how many billion out to clients?
I think it's some insanely big number.
They sent 1,000 trillion the other day, but it was the same interface mistake because this interface basically defaulted to one with 100 noughts after it. Like it wasn't a Google, but it was.
Which is amazing because Citibank had that problem in 2005 with a trader called Dr. Evil, where he did this huge trade and messed up loads and loads of stuff like that. That was all claimed on bad fingers and bad interface.
Yeah, no. So I think it was like this was Matt Levine's write-up of it, like this horrendous interface that like defaulted to sending the money to everyone, and they accidentally there was can't remember who it was. It was like it wasn't Pret, but it was somebody in the UK that was like struggling, and they had a whole bunch of debtors and they were raising money from somebody else, and Citi, instead of paying the money into Pret, paid the money directly from the new debtors to all of the old debtors, like in the exact right proportion. And the courts actually ruled that they weren't allowed to claw it back because of one reason or another it had all gone out. But, and then the other day, they accidentally sent like $1 trillion to somebody. Now, fortunately, they didn't have $1 trillion, so they couldn't send $1 trillion. But for all of those enterprise things, these horrendous interfaces where you could just never be bothered to rework them, it might be super interesting. Instead of rebuilding the whole thing with the shitty software that local health authorities have to use and everything else, if both sides start to work in unison with each other, you won't have to rebuild the software. You'll just build the MCP layer above, and the LLM will deal with rebuilding the interface on the fly when you interact with it.
I think we're very far away from that
Yeah.
at the moment, given that the hardest part of LLM coding is currently normal interfaces based on the protocols that we currently have. Like, given that the full discretion to build something off the cuff just for you, personalized, given that it knows the information and what's the likely use case, and probably not the likely use case, is the use case of it because you've told it. That's what I'm looking to do.
I think
That's not happening. I'd say anytime soon. That means it's not going to happen in the next few
That's not
weeks.
the next
Maybe
6
next
weeks.
few months.
no, that's in I think we can see where, like, how quickly we get there. I have no idea, but I think we know in 10 years' time the kind of world that we're going to be living in is going to be in that direction in some way, for sure.
There we go. Back to the MCP again. Okay.
I need to go and like lie down in a dark room for a little while. Like,
Yeah.
Speaking of a dark room, I have to run because I've got to say goodbye to good night.
Yeah, conversation, people.
Great
Thank you
chat,
very
Liz.
much.
thank you guys.
Later.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye-bye.
See you all.